When I was a theology student, training to go through for the ministry, I lived about an hour and 20 minutes, maybe an hour and a half, from the campus of Duke University. And at Duke University, there's a very famous church. It's called Duke Chapel. And they have lots of money in an endowment and a big congregation, and so they often bring in very famous speakers and preachers and that kind of thing. And so quite often when I was living in that area and studying for the ministry, my friends and I would get up a little bit earlier on Sunday morning, and we would make a road trip to go to worship at Duke Chapel. And the regular minister there was himself quite a well-known preacher, and he would often say something like this. He would never say it exactly the same way twice, but he would make the same point repeatedly. And he would say to his congregation, you people are a little bit strange, aren't you? You've decided to get up unusually early on a Sunday morning and forego all of the other things you might have done with this fine day, and you've decided to get dressed up when you didn't have to, and you've come into this old-looking building, and you're singing songs out of an old-fashioned hymn book, and you're listening to a speech. You people are just strange. Christian worship is an odd thing, I think, from our culture's point of view. At least, maybe some of your friends and family think that you're a bit crazy or eccentric for coming to church. Maybe they humor you while you engage in this silly superstition that you have. This past Tuesday, January 6th, was the Christian Feast of Epiphany. It's a day which doesn't move around to fall on a particular day of the week. It's always on January the 6th. And since that wasn't a Sunday this year, I wanted to take today to look at the remarkable biblical story which lies behind the Feast of Epiphany. It's a story of perhaps the ultimate worship road trip. That of the Magi who traveled from Asia to Bethlehem to pay their respects, the New Testament Gospel of Matthew tells us, to worship the young Jesus. The Magi were astrologers. They were people who looked to the sky and to the signs of the stars and other things visible, especially in the night sky, to try and discern some meaning for the world and for their lives. They perhaps came from Persia or maybe Babylon, and they saw something in the sky that called them to travel to Palestine. And they made their long journey, and they went specifically to the major urban center of the country, that is Jerusalem, and they inquired, "Where is the newborn king? We have seen his star in the east where we live, and we have come to worship him." We might wonder, what is this remarkable sign they have seen that they have interpreted as a call to get up from their daily lives and routine and make a journey of many hundreds of miles, a journey of weeks at the least, to come and pay respects, even to worship one whose identity is still unknown to them? Well, we don't have a concrete answer. Halley's Comet apparently was visible in about 8 BC. It's possible that's what they saw, although it doesn't seem too likely. One popular answer is this phenomenon known as the triple conjunction. Every 800 years, Jupiter and Saturn become very visible to the naked eye, and they approach each other 3 times to the point where they're almost touching. That's the triple conjunction. And it's been suggested with some reasonability that in that cultural worldview, Jupiter represented kingship, while Saturn represented Palestine. And so one possibility is that they saw this in the night sky. It happened around 5 or 6 BC and may have signaled to the Magi that a king is coming to Palestine. It's possible, but not certain. The Magi themselves seem to be taking a chance with this journey. They don't seem to know all the answers they're looking for, just that there is something which has drawn them to come for reverence and worship, and as the story will later tell us, with gifts. It's a story which has perhaps captivated our imagination ever since we were children and first heard the story of Christmas. I remember a couple of years ago, Taco Bell restaurants came out with a new product on their menu. They call it the Loco Taco. It's a taco wrapped in a shell that tastes like a Dorito chip. And they launched this new menu item with a commercial, and it portrayed the story of a young guy who got in the car and drove his friends over 900 miles to the nearest Taco Bell restaurant so he could try this item. Now, my first reaction when I saw the commercial, which I imagine is the same reaction of everyone who saw the commercial, you've got to be kidding me. Who drives 900 miles just to get a taco? I saw one clip on the internet where someone jokingly wondered, if you're driving 900 miles to eat a taco, will you stop to eat something else on the way? But interestingly, the commercial story was based on something that was true. This young guy from upstate New York was traveling across country, and he happened to be going near Toledo, Ohio, some 600 miles from his home. And somehow he happened to know that the Taco Bell in Toledo was where this product was being launched. And so he did make a point of going to that restaurant to try this taco in a Dorito shell. It's a pretty good taco, by the way. If you are a Taco Bell fan, I think that you would enjoy this. And they're not going to give me a percentage of the sales, I don't think, for that plug. A story too strange, too marvelous to believe, but one which had something true behind it. When the Magi arrived in Jerusalem and inquired, "Where is the newborn king?" Matthew tells us that the current king, Herod, was greatly troubled, and all of Jerusalem with him. I think most of us tend to have in our mind's eye the idea that the Magi set out from their home in the east with their sights focused very narrowly on Bethlehem. They were headed straight to the stable, and on their way they stopped for a quick bathroom break in Jerusalem, and while they were there had a little word with King Herod. But in fact, they didn't know exactly where they were going. They went first to the city. And Matthew tells us that their visit was widely publicized. Everyone seemed to know they were there and why. And everyone seemed to know that Herod, who at this point in his life and career had turned into a real tyrant, would not receive the news well, and they were fearful of how he would react. Matthew tells us that King Herod convened a meeting of the local government. He called together the scribes and the chief priests to try and find out what lies behind this visit of the Magi. Where will this new prophesied king come from? The visit of the Magi to Jerusalem would have been covered by the equivalent of cable news in the day. There would have been headlines, however they were broadcast in that time. Is there a new king? Who might he be? How will current king react? The visit of the Magi to Jerusalem was a publicized and very disruptive event in the lives of the people of that time and place. One of my favorite movies from my days as a university student. You know that time in your life when you get to sit around with your friends and watch movies? One of my favorite movies from that time was called Office Space. It's a movie about software developers, and they work in cubicles at some faceless corporate entity known as Initech. And the crisis in the story comes when head office sends in some consultants. How did they react, the employees? Did they say, oh great, here's some consultants to help us do our jobs better, to help our company be more effective? No, they were upset. They knew almost immediately that some of them were probably going to lose their jobs. That when they were called in for their appointment with the consultants, they were going to have to interview for their own jobs. The visit of the consultants was a crisis. It was a message to some of them that they may or may not be needed. And they didn't respond well. One of the things they did when one of them got laid off was to steal a fax machine and take it out to a field and smash it with a baseball bat. It was a crisis. Well, after Herod had learned from his political advisors that the prophets of old had said that God's anointed or chosen king, that is the Messiah, would come from Bethlehem, Herod then called the Magi secretly and said to them, why don't you carry on to Bethlehem and see if you can find this newborn king? Because I also would like to go and pay worship to him. Interestingly, not one person in the last 2,000 years had believed Herod when he said that he too wanted to go and worshiped the child. He was a bad liar. And then Matthew's gospel tells us that the Magi then followed the star until it came to rest over the place where the child was. This is the part of the story which has always seemed most confusing to me. How is it that the star moved and then came to rest? How is it that this star could indicate a particular spot on planet Earth? You know, I can look up at the night sky and I could perhaps identify a particular star if someone told me what I was looking for. What I wouldn't be able to do is tell you exactly what spot above planet Earth that star was sitting. It's also confusing in the narrative. Why couldn't Herod and others see and follow that star? If in fact they couldn't see and follow that star, why didn't Herod just send some of his people to follow the Magi at a discreet distance? This element of the story, which tells us that the star moved and then stopped, I think is a particular problem for anyone who would like to suggest that what the Magi saw originally at their home in the east was this triple conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn, because surely this phenomenon where the two planets appear to almost touch cannot be what is described as pointing the Magi to the particular location of Jesus in Bethlehem. I think one commentator has put it best, that we are not going to have a lot of luck, I think, in trying to find out exactly what it was the Magi saw and followed, but somehow that God was guiding them, whatever that may have been or looked like in the time. And I think that touches on an important truth, that sometimes the call of God, the communication of God, the guidance of God is something which speaks particularly to us as individuals. Oh, sure, sometimes there are general things that anyone who took a moment to think could figure out. But sometimes there are particular ways that God reaches out to us individually, ways which are discerned only through faith. Some of you may remember a story that our own Ken Hedges told here on our anniversary Sunday in November of 2013. Ken was in the British Army as a physician at the time of his episode, and he was recruited to be part of an expedition to walk across the surface of the Arctic Ocean. And just before he left, some of his fellow officers gave him a note with an inscription from Psalm 139, and it said, in prayer to God, where shall I go from your presence? Where shall I flee from your spirit? If I go to the farthest corners of the earth or to the farthest reaches of the sea, there you will be with me. There your hand will hold me. Well, Ken didn't think much of it at the time, a nice gesture by some of his friends. Well, sometime later, after the expedition had proven much more difficult than expected, there was a difficult moment in the tent where the men were staying, and the leader of the expedition turned on the radio, which was something he never did. And right at that moment, they turned on the BBC, and what did they hear but a church service? And a person reading those very same words from Psalm 139. Where can I go from your presence? Where shall I flee from your spirit? It was as if God, through that voice on the radio, had reached out and spoken to him. No one else in that tent heard the voice of God. It was a message and a communication heard by one person and perceived through circumstance and through faith and openness to the voice of God. The Magi found the place where Jesus was, and Matthew tells us they went into the house where he was staying. They went into the house where he was staying. This is one of the important clues that suggests to us that the Magi, contrary to popular perception, did not arrive on the night Jesus was born at the same time as the shepherds. They likely arrived sometime later. They went in, and Matthew tells us that they presented their gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh, and they worshiped the child. This is where the unexpected element of the story is meant to strike us most. In contrast to the so-called Jewish king, Herod, who was fearful of the Messiah, fearful of the fulfillment of God's promises, who in fact we know to have been secretly plotting to eliminate this one whom God would send. Here are these foreigners who have come from a long way away to worship the one God has sent and the one in whom God has come. It is a remarkable contrast. It is a warning to the insider who wants to take religious practice or even a relationship with God for granted as a source of privilege. The story is here saying it doesn't matter who you are or where you come from. Come and worship God. And if you are the religious insider who does not want to worship God, who wants to set the will of God as opposition, then you are outside that will of God. Some of you who are golfers may remember that in the year 2000, Tiger Woods was having one of the greatest years not only in the history of golf, but in any kind of competitive sports. Tiger Woods was dominating almost every tournament he played in, and it's a sport where it's very difficult for one person to dominate. That year he won the U.S. Open by 15 shots. He was at 12 under. The second place finisher was at 3 over. That summer I was back in my hometown of Cambridge working at White Rose, the garden center, for my summer job. And Tiger Woods had just signed a sponsorship deal with Buick. And so, therefore, he put on his schedule the Buick Open Tournament, which is just outside of Flint, Michigan. And I always had Thursdays off that summer. And I did some preparation and looking up online and found that Tiger Woods was teeing off about 7 a.m. At this tournament on Thursday for the first round. Well, the Wednesday night I closed the store and got off about 9:30. I was in bed by around 10. I set my alarm for 2. I have never set my alarm for 2 in the morning before. I left the house at 2:30 and picked up my friend. We drove the 4 hours to the tournament. We got there about 6:30. We got on the shuttle bus that took us to the course, and we had an amazing day of watching golf. If any of you are golfers, you can come up to me afterwards, and I'll tell you about a couple of the shots that Tiger Woods hit. Absolutely amazing. With tremendous atmosphere. There were thousands upon thousands of people there. You were squeezed in. If you wanted to see Tiger Woods, you had to go about 4 holes in front and wait there for him to arrive. We and so many others were there to show reverence for this great. Why did the Magi travel such a long way to go and worship this Jesus, the one whom, frankly, they could not have quite expected to find and to find in that place and in that way? I think at this point it's unlikely that we will learn any more details about the story to answer any of our questions, certainly not to find out what was their mindset in setting out for such a long and difficult journey for this singular purpose. A better question for us is not why did the Magi go, or what more can we learn? But why have we come here to worship that same one? Why have we gotten up at perhaps an unusual hour and given up the best part of our Sunday to come into this old building, maybe even to get dressed up, to sing some old-fashioned songs, to listen to a speech? Why have we come to do this thing which makes our friends and family think us peculiar? We have come because that little one, visited and worshipped and presented with gifts by the Magi, was and is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. No matter who we are or where we come from, we are called to respond with our gifts and with our praise. Even when there is mystery and unanswered questions, we come with our praise. Amen.